What's up, guys? Welcome back to Startup Growth Stories from Product 10X, a startup accelerator for early-stage enterprise SaaS startups with a focus on product-led growth. If you are an entrepreneur with a great idea or a founder with a super early-stage company, you are in the right place. Stick around to get insights from other startup founders and learn from peers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Product 10X Founders Series podcast. Today, we have with us one of the industry veterans, stalwarts of cybersecurity space, and it is my immense pleasure in welcoming Richard Seierson to the Product 10X Founders Series podcast. Rich is, to tell you the truth, serial CISO he's been with G Healthcare, Twilio, LendingTree, the list goes on. But last but not least, what we are here to focus today is he's a co-founder of a security startup based here in the Bay Area called Soluble.ai that is aiming to revolutionize the way that enterprises secure their development infrastructure within the cloud when it comes to DevSecOps automation. So welcome, Rich, to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Anand, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here. And it's a beautiful day. I'm looking out the window, and it's just the perfect time to do a podcast, then go outside.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for spending the time. And to get started, Rich, one of the things that we wanted to ask you as an expert in the cybersecurity space is we're really eager to get an update about what Soluble is, what should companies be excited about, and how are things going with Soluble?
Sure. So really quick, in terms of Soluble, we're solving a very specific problem. And it's a problem that I encountered not only at GE, where we work together, but at Twilio, which was arguably one of the first cloud native companies to go public, and even at Lending Club, where I met my co-founder. And the problem was this: it was getting easier and easier to get misconfigured cloud infrastructure exposed to the public. And it was getting easier because it was more and more, not just DevOps, but developers who were creating and publishing cloud infrastructure. And as a security practitioner, we had a lot of tools for finding that stuff in production, but we didn't have a way to make sure it was fixed easily or done right in the first place in development. There just wasn't anything out there in the enterprise that I could pull down that was really palatable to developers. So I decided that before I'd go on to yet another CISO gig, I would take a stab at trying to fix this problem. Basically, making it really easy to secure your cloud infrastructure in development in a developer-first approach. So that's what we've done at Soluble. Really easy, and I also say really cost-effective. In particular, right now, we have a very, very generous free tier because we just really believe this is a big problem, and we want to see people getting at it and securing their clouds.
That's brilliant. I mean, that's just a fascinating story. And I'm a huge developer advocate, running and building cloud platforms. And what Soluble is aiming to do is going to definitely take that shift-left mentality, just not in theory, but in practice. So absolutely brilliant, on that. And we'll come back to some of those topics as well. So moving on to some of those topics, Rich, around, just looking at the data from the pitch book, right? Just in the first quarter of 2021, there have been about 442 deals in the US-based, deep tech startups, right? And what are some of your lessons that you've learned from your experience in the Soluble journey? Like, if you want to share something to the aspiring founders.
Sure. And since we're talking about aspiring founders, I'll say something which I think most of them probably have read. Reading something and knowing something are not the same thing, by the way. And in fact, to preface this, I'll quote a quote that I learned at GE, actually. And that is, do all the wrong things first. And I think that was attributed to Edison. When I first heard it, I thought it was a joke. I liked it, but then I think it was actually Thomas Edison who said that. And this is what I'd say to any aspiring founders. If there's one thing that I've learned, do the smallest, most useful thing first. Really constrain your problem and your solution and make it tiny, tiny, tiny. Solve one real problem really well. And you may have a hypothesis about what that is. You may think that you're going to solve a problem that you have. The problem that you have may very well not be recognizable by anybody else. So you got to take that tiny thing and really quick, not in months, maybe in weeks or days, get that out in front of people and get responses and learn. So again, what I'd say is, be fast, be really tiny about what you're going to solve, and get that out there in a frictionful manner so that you can get feedback. Now listen, I think there's like 1,000,000,001 blog posts where they say that, and here's yet another person who's telling you to do the same thing. You won't do it, by the way. I double dog dare you, entrepreneurs out there. You're going to do the exact opposite. And you know what? Hey, listen, that just means you're normal. But if there's any encouragement, you can at least get to this faster. It's tiny, small, constrained problem.
Absolutely. And Rich, you've hit the nail on that, which is focus on the pain points, focus on the real needs from a customer, on the target persona perspective. And that's what Product 10X is all about, talking about product-led growth, right? And just from from our perspective, we have onboarded several SaaS and deep tech startups, right? Product companies, a lot of them in the super early stage, and then going through their maturation. As a thought leader, in the cybersecurity space, in the serial CISO, so you've been on the buyer side of this, this whole, evaluating and, bringing and taking chances on companies and, and so on. So what advice do you have for, aspiring cybersecurity startups, with your experience, around being the buyer persona? Because I do feel that cloud is basically taking off, in a big way. And the security around the cloud is also becoming a big factor. So what are your, advice or, points of, work that you would like to focus on from a startup founder point of view?
Sure, it's a big question. Let me just frame this a little bit. So you mentioned that, now I'm on the vendor side. I actually got my start out of grad school over 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I worked for my first venture capital-backed company. My first company was not a security company, by the way. This is 25, 26 years ago.
Yep.
And then shortly after that, I worked back to back at 2 venture capital-backed security companies. That was actually over 20 years ago as well. So I've been doing this for a while. So I was on the vendor side, and then I got onto the operations side. I was some various reasons for doing that, associated with family and whatnot, and then came back to this side of things.
Yep.
And so I think I've had both the perspective of the builder and the buyer, and so just wanted to give that background so what I say will perhaps make sense.
Yep.
For the aspiring security startups, entrepreneurs, and founders out there, what would I say? I'm going to echo kind of what I just said earlier, which is, again, focus on a very specific problem and I'd add to this, for a very specific persona. And I think that can be very hard for a founder if they don't have both the operational experience as well as the entrepreneurial experience. But I'd actually say, if you haven't lived in the salt mines, you haven't had that experience, then it's going to be all that much more important for you to do, as I mentioned before, which is get that small thing out in front of somebody so you can get feedback. And I'd say that's going to be super key. If you're a month or two in and you're building away and you haven't talked to several dozen different potential customer types, be they individual contributors to executives, then just know that you're probably doing it wrong. And again, you're probably normal in that approach. So again, for those who are aspiring security innovators, you're going to have to get in front of people real quick. Now, I want to add one more thing to this, because you had mentioned this as well, bringing in the cloud and the differences. And you also mentioned ShiftLeft as well. I would say this too. What it means to do security is really, really changing. again, if you look at more modern digital transformation, you look at cloud native development, again, kind of the areas where we focus on, what's really changed on the shift left thing is, in particular, infrastructure has shifted left. We talk a lot about security shift left. That's a security term. I don't know if that's a term that's really used by DevOps people, SRE, and developers. But what that really means is that, the stack, has really gone to the public cloud, right? In terms of the hardware and whatnot. And of course, along the way, starting about 10 years ago, we were able to define our infrastructure and our stack as code, right? So we started seeing, infrastructure as code materializing, Terraform and all that. So less click ops to materialize your cloud infrastructure. So as you started seeing more infrastructure as code and APIs, you started seeing less people with the word ops in their name having jobs. I mean, this sounds really harsh, but the normal, just the pure ops person, that person doesn't largely exist in more modern enterprises starting the last 10 years. It really, that doesn't. We even see the role of the CIO. I've worked for 4 companies that didn't have one. Yeah. So well, why would that be? Well, because we didn't have any infrastructure. I mean, other than granola and our laptops, we just didn't have anything. We see CISOs taking on the role of CIO as well. It's kind of fascinating. Now, this is not the case in your large hulking enterprises that are old. I get that. But anyway, so shift left. So infrastructure continues to shift left. What continues now, we have serverless, right? We have functions as code. We have distributed computing with Kubernetes. But all these things are oriented towards enabling the developer to be independent, to have the freedom and to have responsibility. So as you're considering what it means, as we're seeing the ops people leave the picture, I think DevOps roles are shifting as well. We're seeing more and more go right to the developer. What does that mean for security? I think that's something to really consider. What is the role of a security practitioner? And I'd actually argue this. I know this is long-winded, but I think that you need to think about the fact that the personas are really shifting. I think in many cases disappearing, and you need to focus on what's the outcome you're trying to achieve, the security outcome you're trying to achieve. We don't know who's going to execute it. I'm going to say it's developers. 99 times out of 100, fast forward 5 years, it will be developers. Just the economies of scale in terms of getting things done just makes sense. And so as you're an entrepreneur considering what you're going to do, you just need to really realize that the old school security application babysitter, the rack and the stack on people were plugging in cords and doing all that stuff, anything that's associated with ops, those roles are really going away. And so long story short, this is where I would think entrepreneurs need to really be focused on from a security perspective, is how do I address this new shift left world? What does shift left mean? It doesn't mean that security persons are shifting left. It doesn't mean that security processes are shifting left. It means infrastructure and everything has gone to the developer. And that means that security as a capability needs to materialize in that context as well. And that's a lot of words, but that's how I feel.
That's just a masterclass, right? So, I mean, just to hear from you as to what, what that really means, this is just, boiling it down to kind of what the real focus is, right? This is the meat of everything that's happening today. And that's just brilliant to know. So having said that, I have actually read your book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. And, I just wanted to, get your like 1, 2, 3, areas where what is a CISO, really, has to focus on, right, from a measurement perspective. And what are the areas that, as you said, the shift left can really help with that risk profile for companies?
Sure. So, necessity is the mother of invention, and boredom is its father, right? So the first part of Shakespeare, I don't know who's responsible for the second part of that. But when I was at Kaiser, I was responsible for a big chunk of security operations across the United States and massive environment. And I was very concerned and dissatisfied with the the taken for granted approaches for prioritizing risk. This is, healthcare, care delivery, as risky as it gets. And so as a security leader, I asked questions and started looking about and started looking at statisticians, started looking at people who were in decision analytics and others for answers, and ran across my co-author, Doug Hubbard, and we became friends. We decided to write a book together to really address this problem. I think this is particularly important, by the way, from a modern perspective. While the, in terms of who's going to be executing security as the developer, the people who are still accountable will be security leaders. You have to have someone who's checking the doers, particularly if you're in regulated environments. Yeah. If you're in financial services, you're in healthcare, you're in some sort of, governmental related thing, or even if it's retail, if it's something that's a serious business, you have to have someone who's ensuring there's accountability. So how do I go, what's the best way for me to know and to scale out accountability? It really is through measurement. By the way, that's not just unique to security. Any serious discipline in the sciences, that's the approach. In fact, measurement's not decoupled. You don't go to people who are making pharmaceuticals and say, hey, you should do some measurement too. You're not working in healthcare. Where would you go in the FDA and have some discussion about measurement that's not, or any serious engineering, any sort of natural sciences, physics, whatever? You're not going to have any decoupling of measurement. Now in security, you do. That's because security is in its adolescence and still maturing as a real practice, or trying to become a real practice. So you said 3 bullet points. I'm sorry, I'm writing my second book on this topic right now, so I'm just thinking about it all day long. Long story short, I got into measurement because I was dealing with the largest, largest health maintenance provider in the United States, if not the world, and I was not satisfied with the current status quo, needed to find a way to really address the accountability that I own. And it's the same accountability that any security leader owns in any company. And this will not change. Again, as everything shifts left, that makes more accountability come on top of security. In fact, I think largely the role of security in the future will be more of a data science oriented, decision science role, very measurement focused. I guarantee it. It'll have to be. I see no other other way. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Rich, since you brought that up, and that's just a brilliant segue for my next thing here, which is, we see a lot of startups, right, that focus on the technology. Hey, I'm AI this, and I'm ML this, and I'm IoT this, and I'm blockchain this, and that. What is your observation on that? The focus on the technology and less on kind of the business or the practical use cases in some of these startups.
Well, I suppose when you're early and you're seeking funding, some of those words can be like ear candy to investors, right? But the reality is that once you're a real company, it's all about the outcomes. Are you solving real problems for real people? And then of course, are you getting mind share? Certainly, I'm just thinking about like super successful security company like CrowdStrike. I don't know that they spend a whole lot of time anymore. I mean, I'm sure it's all their site, but they don't spend time obsessing on AI and whatnot. Again, it's about the outcomes. Are you eliminating risk? At a, am I getting as a buyer, am I getting a good ROI on that? And if it's not working and you say, but AI or but ML, I'm going to say, but I don't care. So, and by the way, I say this as being someone who was, I do a lot of work in this space. I was very early in having teams that were doing machine learning and data science. And end of day, even with the teams that I built my own, it's all about, were we finding and stopping bad guys? It doesn't matter how fancy graph algorithm or whatever, or that we're using some new neat infrastructure. That, again, in a day, that doesn't matter. Are you finding, and are you stopping the bad guy, and are you doing it at a price point that's reasonable?
And that's just a brilliant way to to kind of put that all in a package. So one last question for this is, what are the 2 cybersecurity trends that you like the most, and why?
Well, I think I've already perhaps spoke on this, and again, I suppose this is something that my company's focused on, but what the industry is calling developer first security. I think, do I like that term? Do I like the term DevSecOps? I don't know. if we look at them as observations of reality, like just, evolution is a set of observations, right? So I observe that developers are executing infrastructure. I mean, they just are. It's not, there's no if, ands, or buts. I mean, everything's oriented towards making them more efficient and reducing costs and creating more velocity. And it's the same things we saw 50 years ago with automobile industry. That was a big shift left with just in time, right? And so that's absolutely what we're seeing right here. So the big thing that I find interesting, and I suppose it's just an observation of reality, is developer first security. Now, the security industry, by the way, is having a real problem with this, because everything they do, from go to market, how their sales are incentivized and organized, how they built their software and systems, is antithetical to that sort of approach, right? It just doesn't. It's just not how the world works. So there's a great problem. They keep thinking, how do we get this to work in development? There's already kind of a fundamental problem with that thinking, by the way. So that is of a high interest to me. And again, maybe this is self-serving, but I think the areas of we used to be called governance, risk, and compliance. That's such an old and awful term, and probably people listening to this, it's making them vomit in the back of their mouths. But I do think that area of, from a security perspective, how do I, as a security leader, as a risk leader, how do I go about looking in particular at third-party risk? This is where I'm going with this. Because again, the first cloud-native company that I worked for, we had floors and walls and windows, granola, and laptops. But other than that, there was just nothing from a technology perspective that we had. And now with COVID, we're seeing a lot more work at home. That'll continue. So you're going to see this continued explosion in distributed compute, third parties, fourth parties, and whatnot. And so this whole area, like, how do I go about thinking about third-party risk? How do I go about getting the best ROI that I can in buying down that risk? And why is this important? Because I need to go to market. I need to go to market in the EU. I need to go to market, Asia Pac. I need to go to market in some sort of critical infrastructure environment. And I need to make sure that I meet requirements. I need to make sure that I'm expedient and fast and low cost in doing that. That's all decision analysis. That's all risk management. And so I think that whole space is incredibly interesting and really challenging. So that's a big interest for me as well. So again, two things to walk away with what interests me. Any sort of developer first approaches, again, that's an observation, but how do you do that? And the thing that interests me too is emerging, how do we deal with third-party risk? How to deal with supply chain using I call more probabilistic programming, decision analysis practices, and whatnot. This is what interests me. That's probably a very self-centered thing, so those truly are all I think about. So
those are just the things that are in the real trends, right? Like if you look at the recent cloud, the state of the cloud, reports and all that, there's like a 20x multiple on cloud in growth, and there's like 80% year-over-year growth for some of these companies. So a lot of that is what you're talking about. It is going to a developer first approach. It is going to, there is probably a lake or filled with some of these SaaS and third-party offerings that people are integrating now together. And all of that is, absolutely, important. Rich, this has been just a phenomenal session, and I felt that there is so much to dig into in a follow-up session with you at some point in time. But really appreciate the time that you've spent. And for the folks on the podcast, please do check out Soluble, SOLUBLE.ai. And it is something that is revolutionizing the way that it takes the developer first approach to securing your infrastructure as code. And a lot of the cloud enthusiasts out there, this is going to be a super important tool that you would want to check out. With that, Rich, wishing you all the very best with Soluble, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, Anand. It's been great. Thank you.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Startup Growth Stories from Product 10X. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletter or review startup material at product10x.com. Until next time.